As a quick reminder, this portion of the program will be recorded for later inclusion on the JMRL YouTube channel, again, barring any technical difficulties. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you the two directors of RaisedRazed. Lorenzo Dickerson is a filmmaker, photographer, world traveler, and founder of the Charlottesville-based Town Media. Lorenzo's interest in local history and passion for social justice is evident in all of his work, much of which he has generously shared with the library over the past few years. Just recently, Lorenzo produced a powerful documentary, Free and Open to the Public, which explores the 100-year history of library service in the Charlottesville area from Jim Crow up until present day. Check the JMRL YouTube channel for a video of this program with the post-film discussion. In answer to what is his mission as a filmmaker, Lorenzo once replied, "I enjoy bringing awareness to stories that either have been forgotten or that people have never known about." Jordan Yeager is a freelance journalist with a focus on issues of equality and racial disparity. A digital humanities fellow at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, Jordy helped launch the African American Oral History Project in conjunction with Lorenzo Dickerson and Ty Cooper. In 2018, a project grant from the Charlottesville Area Community Foundation led to Mapping Seville, an ongoing project for the design of mapping racist housing policies and covenants. In an interview with BPM, Jordy stated, "If we don't know our history, what does it say about our future?" And on that note, I'd like to now turn things over to Lorenzo Dickerson and Jordy here.
Well, thank you for having us, and thank you for coming to watch the film. This is actually the first screening that we've had since the initial premiere, April 30th. Yeah. So yeah, we're excited. We've got a lot scheduled over the next 6 or 7 months or so.
How did you want to structure this in terms of?
If you want to just discuss the film, and then when you're ready, we'll just jump into audience Q&A. We'll probably have a lot, so.
Give some background story on the film and how we got started, really. BPM came to me May of 2020, so shortly after the pandemic started, and was interested in telling a story. And they asked me if I had any ideas, and it just so happens that Jordy and I had been kicking around this idea for quite a while. So it just made sense. We work well together. Jordy's my favorite person to work with, so it was an automatic for me. I reached out to Jordy and said, "What do you think?" And he was on board immediately. We had the title of the film and a different graphic other than the one that you saw, this kind of primitive one that we had put together before we even had the story. But both of us grew up here. We both grew up here. We graduated the same year from high school, and we always heard stories of Vinegar Hill in bits and pieces. My great uncle and aunt owned the first African American owned hair supply store on Main Street, which is right next door to where Grocery and Tavern is now, the former Inge store. So growing up in the 90s, spent a lot of time there, and he would always tell stories of going to Vinegar Hill, to the pool hall, to the store, and it was all these positive stories. But of course, in the last few years, the stories that we hear at Vinegar Hill are only of the destruction. So as we got started making this film, we really wanted to give you that background history on the destruction, the why and the how, but also to really dive deep into the life in Vinegar Hill that occurred, and to do that by actually talking to folks that lived it.
For sure. Yeah, and so much of Lorenzo's work, I mean, you're on film, what, 8 or 9 at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so much of his work centers exactly on this element of bringing history forward into our lives today, which is really, I think, what brought us initially together in terms of how we tell stories, why we tell stories, so that we could see the past in the everyday streets that we grew up in, because we never got this in school. We never, this was stuff that we either heard from friends and family or we were discovering just now, which is much, I think probably the case with most of us. But there are people who have lived this history, and we're fortunate enough to be in proximity and in communion with them. And so being able to kind of take those stories and really be trusted with those stories in a way that brings them out in that compellingness of kind of treading through lines. One of the things, we work closely at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center with Dr. Andrea Douglas, the executive director there. One of the things she pointed out to us early on was the simultaneity of urban renewal with massive resistance, right? And I grew up, much same as probably most people, knowing of massive resistance, knowing about the Charlottesville 12, knowing about the desegregation of schools in Charlottesville, but always thinking of those as very separate and isolated events, that urban renewal happened and massive resistance happened, but not thinking of them as literally happening back to back, which painted together makes perfect sense in terms of motivations, in terms of where people are coming from, how they're maneuvering or strategizing, and also how the poll tax can really something so far back in terms of 1902, that this far-reaching antiquated almost law still had its fingers around outcomes and determination factors all the way up to the 1960s, that without somebody like Dr. Douglas or people who have lived through that, to put that into context, as storytellers, that's what we live for, is to really make those through lines and those connections.
Well, it's very appreciated because all of that can be lost in one generation.
Yeah.
And so for you all to make the effort to talk to your families and people that lived through this. My family moved here in 1961, and I had older siblings who were at Lane when they began tearing down Vinegar Hill. And then I was in the 8th grade class that went to Jefferson School while they were building the junior. And I remember I used to catch the bus where Mr. Inge's store was. And he would always be standing out there on the corner, no matter the weather. And he just looked so sad. I just remember that so distinctly. But I mean, I also remember them taking down, it was like 6 or 7 blocks. And the thing that always troubled me was, where did all these people go? Where were they supposed to live when you just go in there and take their houses down? Well, yes, there was West Haven, but that didn't near, I mean, there was a fraction of the people who were living in that neighborhood. And there were some articles in the Daily Progress about 5 years ago about people who had grown up in Vinegar Hill and talking about what a vibrant neighborhood it was. And you don't ever get that back when it's eliminated. So thank you for what you've done. I just think it's so important.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, that is, I think Rob Nelson makes a mention of it, but that ability to form common cause, I think, is how he puts it right there.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, yes, there's the physical displacement, the destruction of one's home, but that more intangible sort of necessity of how community is actually impactful in terms of lobbying for neighborhood improvements, of getting members of council and boards of supervisors to pay attention to what your desires and needs are, that all of that is then fractured as a result of that. And the truth is that people move to the county, they move different parts of the city. So one of the things that we also kind of got brought out in the film, we weren't able to really kind of put the geographical or the cartographer sort of lens on it, but is the surrounding ecosystem of the county. And so much of the work that Lorenzo does outside of this film is based in the county. That when Mr. Inge has all of these things for sale in his grocery store, where do those things come from? right? Whether it's livestock or poultry or whether it's vegetables or twine or, you know, these sorts of things, all of that is that surround. So you're talking about $1.6 billion that those business grossed in 1960, but then think about the ripple, because that wasn't quantified. That wasn't, you know, and that is really the far reaching impact of how far that goes.
Where did they go? I mean, it would be fascinating to see, you know, some information, factual information on, you know, dispersal of and how much this community has been impoverished by that loss over the years. I don't know if there's any way to trace out migration patterns, but you know, that would tell us a lot too.
Yeah, that deeper impact.
Yeah, sure, for sure.
Yeah, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the fact that it wasn't just homes that were destroyed, but businesses. And you spoke just now a little bit to, you know, maybe they were sourcing their products from the surrounding area. I don't know if local businesses, local Black owned businesses were sourcing their products, you know, from Black families in the county. But can you talk a little bit more about the, not just the breaking up of the community, but the fragmentation of a centralized, you know, business and residential district?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, and not only are folks losing their homes during this process, but, you know, people are losing their livelihoods, are losing their communities as a whole. So even if you were to move to West Haven or to move to Ridge Street or other places, you can't come back to your home, but you also can't come back to the stores that you used to come to before. And those families aren't able to continue those businesses. Those businesses are not able to be left to the next generation or used to pay for college and that sort of thing. So that the removal of Vinegar Hill, it lingered for quite a while in various different ways. A lot of times we think about it as a surface thing, like, oh, you know, there was homes that were destroyed. It's like, no, there was a lot more generationally that was destroyed by taking away this neighborhood.
And one of the things, I don't think that made it into the film. There's so much that didn't make it in, but we're working on that. We're working on some other things. But
I think it was a good
thank you.
thing, you know, that any more you in the next one.
Right.
Yeah.
One of those things was that, excuse me, Deb and Berlice Bell. So they're a mother and daughter couple, of course, with JF Bell Funeral Home. There were a couple businesses that family ran. So not just quality retail, but also a taxi service. And this was, you know, kind of like they described it as kind of the upper class taxis, right? Like they wanted their drivers to be very professional, very smartly dressed, open doors for passengers, these sorts of things. And they were training, you know, drivers from a very early age. So it was this apprenticeship program where that was enough money to raise a family on. This wasn't just a side hustle or something. You know, these were jobs that were substantial enough to, like, you could earn a living. And so that was another business. They relocated this quality retail store to Fifth Street, and they stayed open for, I think, what, 5-6 years, something like that. But that's the other ripple effect from, you know, businesses closing down, is where do they go? How many of these actually reopen?
Like the barbershop.
The barbershop.
You need a barbershop. Where did it go?
Exactly. And yeah, there were a couple I know, you know, that relocated down to Rose Hill and various places. Ferguson's had a funeral home on Ridge Street, for instance. But again, where is your clientele? Is your clientele passing by your front door every day, or do they go out of their way? And this, of course, is happening as the rest of the city is desegregating. And so you have what was once a very focused African-American economy that is now being dissipated into a broader economy that, you know, that black dollar is then getting diffused into different parts of the city in that way too. And so, but the other aspect to it, I think, is you know, you kind of almost we didn't point it out, but you definitely saw in the buildings on Vinegar Hill, much as the buildings on the downtown mall today are, you know, if you look at like, say, the Mud House, for instance, the storefront is on the bottom floor, the residence was on the upper floor, right? And even today, if you go into Tavern and Grocery, which we did to do some filming, you know, the upstairs dining area is called what, the Booker T. Washington room, I think, right? And so because that was where people stayed, those were the residences, whereas the grocery store is on the first floor. So the other project that is happening at the Heritage Center, the mapping project, is looking at racial covenants. And one of the things that is often included in property deeds is that this home shall not be used for any other purposes than residential purposes, right? And so this was a way to you know, very distinctly and specifically segregate, not just based on race, but also use. And so you have people, you know, this is how economies work. You didn't have a separate building for your business. It was very much part of the family. It was very much part of who your position in this community was. It wasn't a separate phone. So that's also launched, I think, which is something that's, yeah, certainly hit us.
Yeah. And one other thing is that Jordy talks about this a lot, and he mentioned it before, but the education system. So at the same time, schools are being desegregated, of course, restaurants and that sort of thing as well, but schools are being desegregated. So if you're African American, and you've gone to a all Black school, one, you're looking to desegregate so that things can be equal. That was the initial thought, right? So that books and that sort of thing, you're not riding a bus and the bus wheel is falling off. That actually has happened in the county. You're looking for your educational experience to be equal, but with desegregation comes some other things as well. So that teacher that was at that one two-room schoolhouse or at Burley, which was a very special place, that really looked out for you and knew your parents and that sort of thing. You don't have that type of experience anymore. And as schools are being desegregated, that's also something that's being lost. At the same time, that connection to students, to other students, and to teachers and that sort of thing. And you know, we know that Burley High School was, you know, a very special place. So we're talking 64, 65 with this story of Vinegar Hill, but Burley closes in 67. Someone had, yes.
Yeah, just what you were saying about the with the schools shifting and losing the sense of community of like the people all know each other, so there was like a sense of investment. It really stood out to me that the same was true with the businesses, where so much could be done on credit and just an economy of trust that is possible when people know each other deeply and have related in this way for lifetimes. Of it's not, I'm just walking to the store and I'm a stranger and I'm like, oh, I can't pay today, but I can pay you in a week. Like that doesn't fly unless we have an economy of trust established already, and that in addition to so much else that was lost, that sense of interconnected depth of relationship where trust and community are part of the economic system was also destroyed.
For sure. One piece that we didn't include in the film, Waukee Wynn, that you all saw towards the end of the film, there's one piece that he mentioned where he's talking about his son. Both of his sons, they own businesses here in the area, and he's talking about how he may not have a lot of monetary capital to pass on to them, but Waukee has been here his whole life. So he's saying one thing that I can do for you for sure is to pass on that connectivity.
That social capital.
Yeah, that social capital and the community that can help you along as you go. Which is so important, and that's something that's, you know, is lost when you lose an entire neighborhood like that.
And it's still happening. I mean, I just saw the news story earlier this week that Rose Hill Market is closing after 30 some years, right? So, yeah, I mean, that was the interesting thing, I think, for me and many people too, is like seeing, Mark Bell talks about that too, is like kind of trying to thread this was explicitly racist in 1965, but today it's happening in like the free market. And so what does he say? Big bank beats little bank, right? And so it's more nebulous. It's less. It's harder to fight. That. It's veiled. It's less
to perfection.
Yeah.
Right.
I thank you so much for this incredible work. I want to say, I'm Carolyn Keyes. I work for Virginia Humanities. We have, just before COVID, we moved into the dairy building in downtown Cathedral off Crescent Avenue. And the developer of that building has definitely, his work has definitely affected the surrounding traditionally African American neighborhood. And we are concerned about what's happening there. And there is a small, traditionally African American neighborhood heading toward Route 29 off Preston on our side of the street, on the Dairy Market side of the street. It's called the Prosser Avenue Historic District. It's under, there is currently a process for making it an officially recognized historic district. That's happening. But the houses that were built by a seminal individual in that neighborhood who was a minister who founded a church which still stands in that neighborhood. The homes that are owned by African Americans in that neighborhood or rented by African Americans in that neighborhood are being snapped up by developers. And there is a threat to actually there was a purchase of the site across the street from the dairy building. They have folks who are working in those buildings have 4 years before they're going to have to move because that whole side of the street was purchased by this developer and going to be redeveloped for mixed use residents. So homes, businesses by the same developer of the dairy building. And I'm wondering if you guys have any comments about that process, which we're seeing kind of all around us in Charlottesville, like it's saying, like Charlottesville is on steroids as far as developers are concerned. And I'm very concerned about what's happening to Charlottesville overall, you know, and whether these really important homes, businesses, gathering sites are going to be destroyed by this development on steroids, what we can do and how we can promote stories of traditional African American neighborhoods, traditionally African American neighborhoods in these areas and the history that will be destroyed if these developers succeed in doing away with these neighborhoods.
Are you talking about Preston Plaza or?
Yes, I am.
So in 4 years, all of those businesses have to leave.
Well, it's going to be redeveloped.
That's a done deal.
It's purchased, it has been, that area has been purchased by this developer.
And they're rolling over,
Yeah.
Sticks and all
Yeah.
that.
now, right next to Washington Park.
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Anything else to check into? I mean, I don't.
I haven't seen anything about that.
I don't believe in covered by the press. Jordy, you might be able to speak to this.
No, I mean,
directly.
it's been a little bit on Twitter, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
It seems
Yeah.
sneaky.
Hello, not sure.
Done.
Yeah, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, one, it's sad. Two, I mean, Waki again mentions it, in the film that the people in power are the ones that are making decisions. So I mean, one, we need more folks like you that care about issues like this to become aware. Because a lot of times we aren't aware, and we aren't aware of the history, which is, part of why we do what we do is to make people aware. Charlottesville today is not, the Charlottesville that we grew up in the 80s and 90s. there's a lot more people living in Charlottesville and Albemarle that are not originally from Charlottesville, Albemarle. And it's difficult to know these stories if you're coming in from somewhere else. If someone doesn't make it explicit to you, right? So I think we definitely need more people to become aware. We need to tell these stories more and put these stories on display front and center, so that people can understand, because I do feel like there are people that care, clearly, right? We're here. And we need to take action in our decision making as far as who we're voting for, and do they care like we do as well.
I'll also add to that this same developer made a substantial contribution to the Young Home campaign. I'm not making a political statement here, I'm just stating fact.
There's the prize there.
Yeah, it's so I mean, it's interesting. There's actually, even a more literal through line. So the church, the Dairy Holdings, which owns that whole complex of the dairy market, and actually the church across the street and the property next to that, which they, put new paint on and kind of rehabbed. That church was Trinity Episcopal for so many years, as many of you know. That church's pastor was Reverend Henry Mitchell, and he was one of the main organizers for sit-ins at Buddy's and the Holiday Inn. And he was part of that civil rights movement with Ray Bell and Eugene Williams and Reverend Bunn. That this is very much, so it's interesting that they came before the Planning Commission maybe 3 weeks ago to seek a rezoning for that church to try to use it as a myriad of uses, right? They proposed maybe a tech hub, maybe a wedding venue. Like, they want to be able to do whatever the community or they decide. They haven't made clear who's the decision maker, but they need a rezoning for that. And so in that, it got myself and several others who kind of watch this or live in that neighborhood of 10th and Page around there, thinking about, well, we're talking a lot more in the last 5 years about plantations and sites of enslavement as should they be wedding venues? Should they be wedding space, right? And that has now become part of our conversation and reevaluating that history in context of what's being done there today. But what about sites of civil rights advancement? What about sites of progression of active community organizing that occurred historically? Another one that comes to mind is Mentors Lodge or Oddfellows Hall, which was right there on East Market Street. West Market, but where Common House is today. And so it's right next to kind of Fellini's, right there on next to Brown's Lock. So that was where James T.S. Taylor, who was our first representative after the Civil War in 1868, he was selected from a group of electors, local electors, to be the first representative. He's a Black man. He fought in the Civil War with the Union. And he's, from his father was born here, he was born here, and he was selected to be on the Constitutional Convention to have Virginia readmitted into the Union. One of the first things he pushed for was reparations, was back pay, right, in 1868. But that history, I don't go into Common House, so I don't know what they've done to interpret that or to make members aware of that. But, it's sites like that where the Jefferson School is another, major one. And thankfully that did not get turned into condos, because if you've been here, that was a real possibility that, realtors were coming in and showcasing these windows as floor to ceiling condo, appropriate, right? And thankfully there was a huge group of people who really rallied together to make that not happen. But yeah, it does raise that question of, as Lorenzo said, how much of this history do we even know to begin with, to know to save that building, to know to save that space? So education is really first and foremost, but then secondly, showing up to, we're just two people. And so like we can try to set our attentions and time and resources on bringing these stories to light, but it really takes people like yourselves to make themselves heard and to show up in these spaces to talk about, what it is, the future that you want. Because without that, like you said, it's kind of business as usual. And so it kind of comes and goes and nobody hears about it until it's too late.
I'm just curious, I found the part where you found the interviewers from UVA who talked to all those people. That was amazing, but it makes me think, like, so somebody at UVA had the foresight to think about, oh, we should interview these people before they die, but did they do anything else? I mean, they knew that this was not okay. Did they try, I mean, I'm curious about that aspect, and if there were any other interviewers that you met and didn't make it into the film.
As far as interviewers that we've met, the most interesting is you all saw Milton Carpenter in the film. His wife, Trina, was also one of those UVA students.
They were not married at the time.
No. So that was pretty interesting for us. She did not want to be filmed. She's camera shy. She didn't want to be filmed.
So
but-
she's sitting right behind us, telling
Telling
we're
us.
interviewing. Yeah.
Do you know who orchestrated the whole idea and what the purpose was other than oral history? And whether or not they were trying to use that for the greater good?
Yeah, it was, well, the project was part of a class at UVA. Jimmy Saunders and Renee Shackelford. And so they really send these students out with a tape recorder and have them interviewing folks that lived in Vinegar Hill, remembered Vinegar Hill. And they later created a book that told these stories and had these interviews in them. Jordy can elaborate more a little bit on how the audio came about.
Oh, for
Which is
sure.
pretty cool.
Yeah. So these interviews, James Saunders was teaching the class. Renee Shackelford, his wife, took the lead, I think, on writing the book. And it's a wonderful book. You should all get it. You can get it. I think there's some local stores that sell it, but you can also get it online. I think it's called End of Black Life,
Black culture
in
Charlottesville.
But essentially she uses long excerpts of these oral histories paired with a great deal of research that she and some others had done to tell the story of Vinegar Hill as best as we could know it. And so we definitely used that as kind of a template and a guide for where to begin. And then we started just reaching our arms out to try to get we found 4 cardboard boxes at the Historical Society of records from the Housing Authority. So they made huge, meticulous, house by house, property by property. They did 2 complete whole surveys, 2 different years, with multiple photographs of every single property, who was living there. We cross-referenced that with all of the telephone directories to make sure that this was accurate. And it also listed people's professions in the telephone directories. And so we were just trying to get as much information as we could. But the actual recordings, some of them have been digitized at the university and made available online. But there are about 30 or 40 different interviews, and so only a handful have been digitized. And so through our work at the African American Heritage Center, somebody had caught wind that we were doing this work, and they found a box of cassettes, in again a cardboard box, and so we've been digitizing those to try to preserve them and make them make sure they don't disappear. And but as you suggest, there's so much there. There's so much that wasn't able to make it into the film that there are stories upon stories just about. And the wonderful thing that comes out in those listening to some 30-odd interviews is like there's no monolithic version of what history was, right? And so if anything, we're hoping that's always kind of the peril of being a storyteller, is like you don't want to distill a story into just this binary narrative where so hopefully we have that context or that complexity there. But yeah, there's tons of material to be had, and that is at the African American Heritage Center. And the oral histories still continue today in a different project, as Evan said about the oral history project that we started. So we're trying to continue that. But I think there was a notion in 1980 when these were done that they wanted, there's some value to that neighborhood and to their experiences for sure, that they knew that this was something. And if in looking at our research, we kind of see these cycles, like a wave of interest came back in 1990, another wave came in the 2000s. And so, these kind of, they come and go. Scott French did a bunch of work, probably about 10 years ago with Hannah and Lance. I forget their last names, I'm sorry. Hannah and Lance Warren. They made another film called This World Is Gone. It's only about maybe 18 or 19 minutes or so. It's available online for free as well. And they interviewed, maybe 4 or 5 people. So it's a short film. I think it was their first. They just did the film with VPM about how the monuments came down. So that's the same filmmakers. But in any case, so work has been done, you know, and we hope that this body of work that we've been privileged enough to work on is then that next iteration for that next generation to pull from, because this story should never be done, right? This should always be elaborated on and broadened. I think.
I think a lot of too what you all see in the film, a lot of it was happenstance, right? You know, things kind of worked out the way they were supposed to, like the box of tapes, right? As well as how we connected with some folks as well. Even, I mean, I've mentioned Joaquin before, but connecting with him, we knew Joaquin, we knew the names of the folks that lived in Vinegar Hill. Wynn is not a common last name.
No.
So we reached out to Joaquin and we're like, you know, hey, would you happen to be related to these folks? And I'm like, yes, these are my grandparents. But he never knew they lived in Vinegar Hill.
Oh, wow.
So that was a great moment to be able to bring that to light.
Did he not know because they didn't want to talk about it, or because they had already passed?
They had passed, and then the family had moved to another spot, so he knew the new home, which I think the family still has today, but he didn't know that they lived in Vinegar Hill prior, which was amazing.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we spent about 10 years in Fikeville, lived there, and I'm just curious from a historical perspective, how you saw the differences between Vinegar Hill and Fikeville, and why at least the residential part of Fikeville was spared and Vinegar Hill wasn't. I just didn't know if you guys, from a historical perspective, understand why that happened.
Yeah, I mean, well, so it's kind of touched on a little bit in there, but not with any great specificity, but much of the groundwork for raising a Vinegar Hill from the city's side was through a contract with a urban developer called Harlan Bartholomew. And he's quite renowned. I mean, he redeveloped St. Louis and Richmond, and all like his fingerprints are all over America. And so in his initial conception with his team, they drew up a map of several maps, but one of which was looking at areas that could be redeveloped, right? And those are kind of the quoted words. And in doing so, Vinegar Hill was one of them. But there was also, these were also one of the things that I think is really important to understand too is that when West Haven was created, a Black neighborhood was destroyed where West Haven is today. And that was called Cox's Row. And so whole Black families were forced to move from Cox's Row. I mean, that could be its own film, right? Should be its own film. But where public housing went in 1965 was also on the ballot and also up for consideration. And so South First Street and Hartman's Mill and kind of that Ridge Street area, that was another site that was being considered. There was a white public housing argument that was happening at the same time. And instead the government decided to take more of a Section 8 approach, which is, you should find single landlords to rent to you throughout the whole city, instead of concentrating all of white residents into one neighborhood. And so these questions are all circulating at that same time. The interesting thing about Fikeville that the African American Heritage Center has really helped me understand is that much of the residential life there was created in the late 1800s through something called the Piedmont Industrial Land Improvement Company. And so this was a group of Black men. It was a cooperative that was developed in 1890. Berkeley Bullock was a founding member. There are several that you would be familiar with, but it was basically a shareholding company where you were paying into the company a certain percent or a certain amount every month, and in return you got a stake in this property, right? Essentially a mortgage, and that was how Black residential home ownership, started for some families. So in the 1890-1891 time period, they bought 15 properties in Fikeville. Their headquarters was right at the top of Vinegar Hill. So they were located right across the corner from where Inge's store was. And so they were perfectly situated to really kind of, take on, this real estate burst of coming out of Reconstruction, right? There's a wave of Black wealth and Black emergence that is very politically active. And, in many many ways, this is what Jim Crow is aimed at, is to stifle that. But that is the history of kind of Fifeville. You know, Quality Retail, where Deb and Berlice were working, their second store was on Fifth Street in Fifeville. You know, the Tonsler home is in Fifeville. There's a lot of, but it never made it onto Harlan Bartholomew's map as a place that needed to be raised.
And what's your theory about that? Why it never made it on the map? It's because it was historically Black owned and had a bigger footprint, and a little bit more not as strategically located, maybe.
How much business was in Pikeville?
Yeah, these are all excellent. I mean, also topographically, you know, that it's a little bit of higher elevation, whereas Vinegar don't even go down. And so, you know, it's not as proximate to the downtown. So much of the conversation around raising Vinegar Hill was to revitalize the downtown, right? Revitalize the white strip of stores on Main Street, because Barracks Road is, you know, on the docket, right? They are developing Barracks Road left and right. And so that's the threat for downtown businesses, that they're going to, the white businesses are going to lose their money to Barracks Road. And so how do we save that is the argument. And so, you know, that's part of that conversation for sure.
Was there a particular administration behind the National Urban Renewal Movement? Was there a Darth Vader in the story?
I mean, Harlan Bartholomew is pretty close. Harlan Bartholomew is pretty close.
On the national level, I mean, is there an administration, a particular president or
Johnson.
Yeah,
Johnson?
I mean, so yeah, Johnson, like the Highways Act was also part of this, right? Of bisecting communities with highways so I think it's, you know, it starts with the 1948. So is that Truman with that U.S. Housing Act in 1948. And so it spans multiple, you know, goes from 48 to 73, 25 years, something like that.
Yeah.
So it spans, you know, multiple presidents have to kind of endorse this all along the way for it to happen the way it
Was the
does.
Great Society.
But yeah, Johnson.
Of course, the urban renewal was a part of.
And a lot of times when you go to all these different cities, small towns, like you mentioned in the film, you know, over 600 municipalities across the country. A lot of times you say, well, in this case, Ridge McIntyre, right? In the case of Durham, North Carolina, it was the Durham Freeway, Highway 147. A lot of times you'll see this major street that cuts right through where this neighborhood once was. So there's a, you know, a physical manifestation of that decision making today.
Are there people in a lot of those other communities where that happened also, making films and documentaries and things like that?
Well, we
Maybe
actually,
not as well.
we actually just somebody contacted us here recently. They're looking to do a film about urban renewal in Harrisonburg area. And hopefully, you know, this can be an inspiration to make films all over telling these stories, because there's so many different cities and so many places that are a lot smaller than Charlottesville and a lot larger than Charlottesville that affected a lot more people and a lot more businesses as well. And that's what we really hoped to do with this film, was to have Vinegar Hill be the lens that we use, but to also show you that this happened all over.
Yeah.
There's a really good one about Treme in New Orleans. That's another film that's very, it ties in with yours really well. What happened to Mr. Inge in his store? I'm curious. Was he able to move somewhere else, or?
So his store stayed open for a little while longer than most other.
1978 or 79.
Yeah.
I forget the specifics, but yeah.
And initially he was for urban renewal until he realized what was actually about to happen. And then he kind of shut that down pretty quickly once he realized it. Yeah, and his family lived upstairs above the store.
And I mean, his family talks about, you know, that as this is happening, they survive urban renewal, but the supermarket industry is emerging, right? And so A&P and, you know, all of these. So at one point in his oral history, one of his oral histories, he's saying that, you know, it's actually cheaper for him to go to a grocery store to buy his product to sell than it is to actually get it from his distributors because of how they're, you know, the quantity with which they're being forced to sell. So like his business model, you know, it was 1891, I think, is when it was founded, to 1978, 79, almost 100 years.
The consolidation of those stores is very much like the consolidation of the schools at the same time, because, you know, Inge's wasn't the only Black-owned grocery store in the area. There were quite a few, you know, within walking distance. And the schools were like that at one point as well, until they were consolidated into much, you know, larger entities. Say Safeway at one point was also on Main Street. Yeah.
So it doesn't seem like it's getting better though, because most people can't afford to move or buy a house, and African Americans, a lot of them are moving back to Louisa or wherever their families came from. So, and now she's talking about this new evil person who's buying up all the building, and then other people flipping houses and reselling them for something. So, do you guys have any hope? Because I'm not feeling really hopeful right now.
Yeah, the real estate market right now is ridiculous. Right? People are buying homes sight unseen, all cash, you know, have never been to Charlottesville, that sort of thing. So that's the type of thing that you have to deal with, and you know, that's what we have to figure out.
And not necessarily to live in them.
Right, exactly.
Like resell.
Yeah.
Airbnb.
Airbnb.
I have a question. So, someone was asking Darth Vader, I think it's racism, right? But connected to that, towards the end of the film, someone says, someone made these decisions, right? What were they thinking? What was their mindset like? And it would be interesting to know their descendants thinking about those decisions. Was it a conscious choice by you not to include that kind of confrontation? Like you kind of focused on the stories of people who were affected by this move, and I think that was really, like, I love the film, it's really good. So is that a conscious choice that you made, and do you think that a different film should be made?
You hit the nail on the head, right? It wasn't a conscious choice to leave that portion out. I think it was timing for us. We were cutting so much stuff. So we showed you, even in the film, we showed you the image of what city council looked like. And if you look, you can see the folks' names, but we don't go into depth. And that's really just because of the time. And the film itself was made for TV. It was made for PBS. So we had time constraint. We had to have it by a certain time. Yeah. So that's really where that came from. But the whole time we were making it, we were thinking, okay, there could be a part 2 where we extend this story further and give you that information specifically.
Well, and in true serendipitous fashion, like we actually had some descendants of the decision makers. Actually, the property owner who, you know, he was a white property owner who had rundown properties that he didn't maintain. One of their descendants reached out and said, I think that's my great grandfather. And so, you know, yeah, I do remember a conversation where we were like, you know, should we put this in there? Is this too much to, like, you know, and because of the time constraints, it was like, could we possibly do justice to that story, which is an immensely important story of like, how do you reckon with the legacy of exploitation of, you know, of all of the decisions that go into leading to what happened to Vinegar Hill. You know, do you do justice to that in 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
You could do one on the dairy market, guys.
We could do, yeah, and we didn't feel like we could, and nor did we, you know, there was kind of that weighing of like, you know, there's a reason why RAISD, RAISED comes first, right? That there's a second destruction of Vinegar Hill that has occurred, and it's a narrative destruction. It is one that erases that story of a century of life that occurred in that space in the wake of telling the story of the destruction, right? That's been the story that has emerged over our childhood or lifetime, that's really come to dominate. And so we wanted to help try to balance that and set that a little bit more right, of saying, you know, these are the stories of people who are living there. I think it's often our desire to, you know, focus on who did wrong and like, let's name names, let's identify the power, let's show how they motivated that power and like how they benefited from it. Like those are important things to understand, because, you know, even today we're talking about comprehensive plans, right, and zoning rewrites and making Charlottesville bike and pedestrian friendly and all these things. We can do just as much damage as urban renewal did in those same conversations today if we're not careful. And so yes, we need to understand how that power was actually used. But we also need to have space for the stories that really made that life in that neighborhood possible. And so we wanted.
Well, I think you struck just the right balance of having the photographs, and for people who are familiar with that era, we were reading them carefully and recognize some of those names. And that way it doesn't put you in a position, you don't have a bone to pick. I mean, you're not going, you're maintaining your focus where it belongs, which is on this neighborhood. And so that's very well done. The other point I wanted to make was Mr. Wynn's comments there at the end, where he's talking about the floor and the ceiling, you know, with his children. And, you know, that really, it was an excellent interview to conclude, because it ties it together. This is what you've shown, and that little clip right there just was the icing on the cake. Well done.
Yeah, Joaquin is an amazing person all around.
Yeah. Well, and the fact you said he didn't grow up here, correct?
He did.
He did grow up
He
here.
did grow up here.
Okay. Well, he's clear-eyed, and you know, when you live here too long, the Kool-Aid and, you know, right. So he very clear-eyed comments he made, I thought.
There was a blurb towards the end with text on the screen where it named an individual who was working on efforts towards the urban renewal reparations and such, and said in 2022 making efforts towards, you know, can you say the name again, where we might, if we're trying to look up more
That
on
was
what they're up to and how that's going.
Yvonne Garrett Patterson. So that was the woman that you saw in the opening of the film from Durham, North Carolina.
Okay.
Yeah, so she's working on a bill for reparation. Yeah, her and my brother.
Yeah, and it's a national bill. So like Asheville, North Carolina, you know, like Lorenzo said, everywhere is experienced urban renewal, 600 municipalities, but Asheville has kind of pushed forward a local reparations program. It's just starting, so it's really too soon to tell how well it's doing, but this bill would be a national one.
Yeah. Yes, in the back there.
Thank you so much for sharing your amazing work with us, and congratulations. And, wonderful doing, and I just live in North Carolina, so wonder why you picked Durham as a connecting point to, you know, the companion cities, and there's still many cities that have gone through this. And my second part of on this last question is how to with people, because the Native Americans, my gosh, talk about reparations. You know, like we got that, and then the awful 100 years of slavery, then, you know, and then now so we got, and then of course we got city, because all these meeting points, and then the culture is, you know, melding together. Geopolitical crisis, you know, people are coming here to sell, starting over. Feeling for all clash together. Can you make some comments about that? We'll first talk about connections like that
And we are on Monacan land. And it's in the city and this county. We are on Monacan Indian land.
Were they comparable size cities? Durham was bigger.
Durham is bigger.
Yeah.
Durham is bigger. So we started with connecting with Durham through Yvonne. That's how we got one connected to Durham, because we knew that she reached out and to Jordy. We knew that she was working on this bill. So the connection with the story made sense, but we also wanted to show a larger city, a different size city, to show you how this happened in various different places. Also, just again, the serendipitous thing, how this worked out. Milton Carpenter, well, one, I used to live in Durham and Raleigh for about 10 years before I moved back home. And Milton Carpenter, whom we saw in the film, he lives in Raleigh. So when we filmed Yvonne and Michael, we filmed Milton all in the same day. That was all done in the same day. It worked out well.
Connection.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting story is that when we went to Durham to film Yvonne and Michael, the spot where their grandfather's drugstore was demolished in the Hayti neighborhood had been a parking lot for 50 years. So we were fully expecting, including them, because Yvonne lives in New Jersey now. We were fully expecting that to still be a parking lot. So we were planning on filming in this parking lot in Durham that day. And when we got there, there's this massive building that's being built.
Like 20 stories high.
Yeah, like the whole block is like a building. It's of all things, right? So again, you know, here we are again, and these things change shape over time, and you know, that's a lot of what Jordy does with the Mapping Seagull project, is showing you how laws, these covenants change over time to say the same thing or to keep out the same group of people, but they change. So if you're not paying attention, it's easy for it to, you know, go under the rug.
That's true. And yeah, just, I mean, briefly to address your last comment is, you know, one of the things that I think has become increasingly interesting to me is just the very basic commodification of land to begin with, right? That this is a conceit that we've all kind of bought into, you know, willingly or not, but it's certainly how our economy and how our kind of society operates. And so I'm working on a podcast. It's a 6-part series with Monument Lab and funding through the Ford Foundation that has a team of reporters all throughout the country looking at essentially the commodification of land, and how, if we were to remove that veil, if we were to take that conceit back and to reimagine what space and land would look like, what would that be? And we have plenty of instances, right? Like, you know, collective land ownership was Native American, but it was also Black. It was, you know, there are countless examples of ways in which people have not exploited each other and or the land in order to live on them. And so looking more closely at those for lessons that maybe we can start to reimagine our future with, which I think is increasingly important, because yeah, I mean, the Monacan Nation, you know, they recently got national status, and then, you know, their headquarters, of course, is down in Amherst. And so their local footprint is relatively small, but, you know, we run up into, just as storytellers, you know, we're not policymakers, we're not, you know, we're not elected officials or anything. So we tell stories, we try to tell history. And one of the things that I ran up against, I was on the Historic Resources Committee, and we were reevaluating the walking tour map that the city kind of puts out. And I suggested we start with, you know, a point of reference of Monacan Indians being here for 10,000 years. And that was resisted, you know, that there was pushback, there was active pushback. I said, well, did they live actually in Court Square though? It was like, did Thomas Jefferson? Did James Madison? Did James Monroe? There's so much more comfort with that story being centered in that place than there is with so anyway, and you know, this is the type of conversation I think that needs to happen again. And I think it's happening more, you know, I mean, certainly the county, I think they started a community read, you know, a semi, I think it's maybe 3 or 4 times a year they do a community read. And I think the first one was about the Monacan Indians, because it was their self-published history. And so, you know, I think those are strides, but yes, there will always be more to be done. And, you know, how land exists, we can tell both stories. I don't think one negates the other, but I think that, yeah, to escape the binary, you have to tell, all iterations of that.
I could just make one comment. I know this is Charlottesville night, but I was born in Savannah, Georgia. And my parents grew up in a kind of self-sufficient neighborhood, undoubtedly because of segregation. And I was born in Savannah, but I did not grow up there. My parents moved away. They're both deceased, so I have no real foundational frame of reference here because I'd love to talk to them about what I've learned tonight. But we've gone back to Savannah and it's nothing like how they grew up. Their property is gone. Just everything's gone. Everything's raised. And they just, they don't recognize anything. But we weren't talking about it from any, kind of standpoint. We were just saying, OMG, look how bad it is here and look what has been done to where we used to live. The hospital where I was born, that's gone. And of course it was a hospital for colors only. So to your point, I believe which one of you said it, but there are lots of stories. And having spent time in Buffalo, New York, I remember a neighborhood that was just destroyed by not a highway, but an expressway. Beautiful tree-lined area. And someone said, let's put an expressway here. And, the heck with who lives there and what their livelihood was. But so, yes, I've seen this in a couple of different instances. And there's probably a lot more stories like this. And I just appreciate you sharing this, doing this and sharing it. And I just wish my parents were alive. I'd love to talk to them about, what they know and what they experience in Savannah. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's always, that is our worst fear, that we won't be able to talk to somebody before it's too late. It's, that's real.
Definitely. It's happened to me several. Jordy mentioned this is like film 8 or 9, but several people have passed since some of these films have been made.
We might have to wrap it up. I'm so sorry, but Lorenzo, Jordy, thank you so much for being here.